The golden glow of the New York skyline spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hayes estate, illuminating the vast, immaculately designed living room. The space was breathtaking, with marble floors, chandeliers that cost more than some people's homes, and an ambience that screamed wealth. But despite its grandeur, the house felt cold. Maggie Hayes stood at the base of the grand staircase, her fingers lightly gripping the railing as she watched her husband, Jonathan Hayes, button up his crisp white shirt in front of the mirror. His suitcase sat open on the bed, neatly packed, a sign that he wasn't just leaving for a short trip. Before we continue with today's story, if you're enjoying what you've heard so far, please hit that subscribe button. Every new subscriber helps me keep sharing these inspiring tales that touch your day. Thank you for your support. He was leaving her again. She had seen this routine too many times before. Same expensive luggage, same expensive cologne, same lie. Taking a slow breath, she spoke, her voice calm but firm. Another business trip, Jonathan. Jonathan didn't even flinch. He continued, unbothered, fastening his cufflinks, his reflection in the mirror. Don't do this, Maggie. She folded her arms across her chest. Do what? Jonathan sighed, finally turning to face her. His expression was impatient, as if she were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Pretend you don't know what's happening. A bit of silence stretched between them. Maggie felt a dull ache in her chest, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly. So you're not even going to lie this time? Jonathan's lips curled into something that almost resembled a smirk. Why should I? We both know what this marriage is now. Maggie's fingers dug into her palm, but her expression remained steady. She had always known Jonathan was drifting away from her. The late nights at the office, the unexplained absences, the perfume that wasn't hers lingering on his shirts. And now here he was, not even bothering to hide it. Her voice was softer when she spoke again. How long? Jonathan raised a brow. How long? What? Maggie swallowed past the lump in her throat. How long have you been seeing her? A shadow of something unreadable flickered across his face, but it was gone just as fast. Does it matter? Maggie exhaled slowly. I suppose not for a second. Jonathan hesitated, as if expecting her to scream, to cry, to beg him to stay. But she didn't. She just stood there looking at him with those deep brown eyes, the ones that had once held nothing but love for him. Now, they were just empty, and for some reason that unsettled him. He grabbed his watch from the dresser, slipping it onto his wrist. You'll be fine without me, Maggie. You always are. She let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. That's what you've always counted on, isn't it? Jonathan didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to his suitcase, zipping it shut with finality. And just as he did, a voice rang out from the hallway. Darling, are you ready? Maggie's stomach twisted at the sound. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Sophie Carter, the other woman. She stood in the doorway, her manicured nails resting delicately on the frame, dressed in a form-fitting designer dress. Blonde curls cascaded down her shoulders. She was everything Maggie wasn't. Young, vibrant, temporary. Maggie refused to look at her. Jonathan, however, glanced at Sophie and smirked, a smirk that made Maggie's blood turn ice cold. I'll be right out, he told her smoothly. Sophie gave Maggie a once-over, then flashed her a sickeningly sweet smile before walking away. Maggie clenched her fists at her sides, not out of jealousy. No, out of rage. Not at Sophie. At herself for letting it come to this. Jonathan turned back to Maggie, expecting something. An outburst, a tearful plea, a reaction. Instead, she simply took a step back. Her expression is unreadable. Go. Jonathan's brows furrowed slightly. What? She met his gaze evenly. If this is what you want, Jonathan, then go. For the first time that night, he hesitated. This wasn't the Maggie he knew, the woman who had always waited for him, always forgiven him, always believed that he would come back to her. This, Maggie. She looked done. Jonathan shook the thought away. This is what you wanted without another word. He picked up his suitcase and walked past her out of their home. Maggie stayed in place, listening as the front door clicked shut and then silence. Not a single tear fell. She simply turned, walked upstairs, and closed the bedroom door behind her. She had let him go, but what Jonathan didn't know was that he wasn't the only one who had made a choice that night. The private jet soared smoothly above the clouds. The hum of the engines filled the lavish cabin. Sophie Carter lounged comfortably in one of the plush leather seats, sipping on a glass of Dom Perignon. She was the picture of luxury long, legs crossed, designer sunglasses resting on top of her perfectly styled blonde curls. Jonathan Hayes, however, barely touched his drink. He stared blankly out the window, watching the endless expanse of blue sky. He felt strangely trapped. This trip was supposed to be an escape, a weekend at an exclusive island resort. No responsibilities, no nagging wife, no complications. Just pleasure. So why the hell did he feel so off? The moment they landed, the staff at the Azure Cove Resort greeted them with practiced smiles and impeccable service. A luxury villa had been arranged, a private pool, beachfront access, and a butler at their beck and call. It was paradise, and yet Jonathan couldn't enjoy a damned thing. Sophie draped herself over him at dinner, whispering sweet nothings in his ear. He barely heard her. She laughed too loudly, talked too much, expected him to entertain her. It was exhausting. Maggie never needed to be entertained. The thought came out of nowhere, catching him off guard. Jonathan shook it off, forcing a smirk as Sophie poured him another glass of wine. Don't think about her. That night, Sophie was already asleep beside him, tangled in expensive silk sheets. When Jonathan found himself wide awake, he stared at the ceiling. Frustrated. Why couldn't he shake this feeling? His mind drifted back home, back to Maggie. At first, he scoffed at the idea. She's probably sulking, probably waiting for me to come crawling back. But then something twisted in his gut. Maggie hadn't looked sad when he left. She hadn't begged, hadn't even thought she had just let him go. That wasn't the woman he knew. Jonathan exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. Why does it bother you? You got what you wanted. Then why did it feel like he had lost something? Lying in that massive, unfamiliar bed, memories began to surface. Small things, stupid things. The way Maggie used to fix his tie in the mornings, even when he insisted he could do it himself. The way she always had his coffee ready, exactly the way he liked it. Black, no sugar, without him ever having to ask. The way she used to curl up against his side while they watched movies, humming softly without realizing it. Jonathan sat up, exhaling sharply. Why the hell are you thinking about this? He was here with Sophie. Oh, Maggie was the past. So why did the past feel like it was still holding on to him? While Jonathan sat in a five-star resort, struggling with thoughts he refused to acknowledge, Maggie Hayes was making her own plans. She didn't spend the night crying. She didn't sit by the phone waiting for him to call. No. Instead, she was redefining herself. She walked into a high-end boutique that morning and, for the first time in years, bought a dress for herself. Not because Jonathan would like it, not because it was appropriate for a gala or an event, but because she wanted it. She sat in a salon chair, letting the stylist cut away the plain, practical look Jonathan had preferred and replace it with something bold, confident, unapologetic. She met with an old friend who had invited her to a charity gala that night. And instead of saying no, as she would have in the past, she accepted. Maggie wasn't waiting for Jonathan to return. She was moving forward. The sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the morning air as Jonathan Hayes sat on the private terrace of his luxury villa. A half-empty glass of whiskey rested beside him, untouched. His phone buzzed on the table, a sharp contrast to the serene surroundings. He glanced at the screen. A message from his longtime friend, Daniel Carter. I can't believe it, Jonathan. You actually let her go? Jonathan frowned. Let her go. His gut twisted. He had a feeling he already knew the answer. Opening the message, he saw a photo attached, and when he tapped on it, his entire body went still. It was Maggie, but not the Maggie he had left behind. Not the quiet, dutiful wife who stood in his shadow, waiting for him to acknowledge her. This woman, she was stunning. She stood in the middle of a grand ballroom, wrapped in a floor-length crimson satin gown that hugged her curves perfectly. Her usually simple brown hair cascaded in soft, elegant waves, framing a face that glowed with confidence. Her lips were red and bold, the kind of color he had never seen her wear before. And the most shocking part? She was smiling. Not a forced, polite smile. Not the small, reserved one she used to give him when she tried to hold their marriage together. No, this was Radiant's freedom. A woman who had just begun to live. And she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a tall, distinguished man, someone Jonathan didn't recognize. He was leaning and slightly whispering something in her ear. And Maggie laughed. Jonathan's grip on his phone tightened. He swiped up, scanning the news article attached to the image of the wife of billionaire Jonathan Hayes stunts at a charity gala. Has New York just found its newest social icon? The article praised Maggie, her poise, her elegance, and the way she captivated the entire room without even trying. Maggie Hayes, the woman he had ignored for years, was now the center of attention, and he was nothing more than a shadow in her past. Jonathan slammed his phone onto the table. His pulse raced. Time. This was a joke, a trick of the camera. Maggie wasn't like this. She wasn't this woman. She belonged to home. Waiting, didn't she? His mind reeled back to the moment he left. She hadn't stopped him, hadn't begged, hadn't even looked hurt. And now, just days later, she was what? Thriving. The thought sent a sharp, unexpected pang through his chest. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Hayes felt replaced, and he hated it for the rest of the day. Jonathan was distracted, so if he noticed, "Jonathan," she said sweetly, stretching across the lounge chair beside him. "You've been staring at your phone for the last hour." He didn't answer. Sophie sighed, leaning against him, pressing a soft kiss to his jaw. "Come on," she whispered. "Let's enjoy our trip." Jonathan didn't move. His eyes were still on his screen, scrolling through more photos of Maggie. Sophie noticed her gaze flicker to the article he was reading, and when she saw Maggie's name, her smile faltered. "She's playing a game, Jonathan," Sophie said lightly, though there was an edge to her voice. "She's just trying to get your attention." Jonathan stiffened. Was this all just a show? Or had he seriously underestimated the woman he once thought he knew? His jaw clenched. There was only one way to find out. He needed to go home. Jonathan Hayes was not a man who second-guessed himself. He made decisions. People followed them. That was the way his world worked. Yet now, for the first time, he felt completely out of control. And it was because of her. Maggie, the woman he had left behind. The woman he had expected to stay exactly where he left her. But she hadn't. And that fact was driving him insane. The next few days at the resort were supposed to be a dream. Sophie certainly treated it that way. She was all smiles and champagne, lounging in the sun, taking endless pictures of herself, making sure she looked perfect from every angle. But Jonathan was barely there. His mind wasn't on the ocean view, the Michelin-starred dinners, or the beautiful woman draped over him. It was on Maggie. Every time he opened his phone, there were more photos, more articles, more videos of her laughing, dancing, being looked at, the way he used to look at her. And worst of all, she wasn't alone. The first time Jonathan saw her standing next to another man, he brushed it off, but then came another, and another. At first, it was that dark-haired businessman from the gala. Then there was an image of her having lunch with someone else, a European investor, apparently. And the latest? A clip of her at a cocktail party. A well-known real estate mogul leaning in to whisper something in her ear. And Maggie, she smiled. Not politely. Not in a way that suggested she was just in during the conversation. No, she smiled like she was enjoying herself. Jonathan's grip tightened around his glass. His jaw clenched so hard it ached. He told himself it shouldn't matter, that she was free to do whatever the hell she wanted. But somehow the thought of Maggie in another man's arms made his blood boil. Sophie was no fool, Leah. She noticed the shift in Jonathan almost immediately. The way he checked his phone, more than usual. The way his mind was never fully with her. One evening, as they lounged on the balcony of their villa, Sophie finally snapped. She set her wine glasses down with a sharp click. "Jonathan, what the hell is going on with you?" Jonathan barely glanced up. "Nothing." Sophie scoffed, crossing her arms. "Really? Because you've been acting like a ghost for the past few days." Jonathan sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's nothing." "Sophie, drop it." But Sophie had already caught a glimpse of his phone screen, and she saw the name Maggie Hayes. Her lips curled in irritation. "You're still checking up on her, aren't you?" Jonathan said nothing. Sophie let out a humorless laugh. "Unbelievable. You're jealous." Jonathan's entire body tensed. "I'm not jealous." His voice was sharp, defensive. Sophie smirked. "Sure. And I suppose that's why you keep refreshing articles about her every 10 minutes. Jonathan shot her a glare, but she only laughed again. "Oh, Jonathan," she purred, trailing a finger down his arm. "I knew this would happen. You never appreciated her until she stopped waiting for you." His patience snapped. "That's enough. Sophie." She arched a perfectly sculpted brow. "Or what? You'll run back to her?" Jonathan didn't answer, because for the first time, he was wondering if that's exactly what he needed to do. Jonathan tried to call Maggie that night. No answer. He sent a message. Nothing. He told himself she was just busy. But deep down, he knew the truth. Maggie wasn't ignoring him because she was waiting for him to fight harder. She was ignoring him because she didn't care anymore. And somehow that was worse than hatred. Jonathan barely slept that night, and by the time morning came, he had made his decision. He was leaving. This trip was over. Sophie didn't take the news well. She stared at him from across the hotel suite. Arms crossed, expression icy. "So that's it," she said flatly. "You're just going home." Jonathan threw his clothes into his suitcase without looking at her. "Yes." Sophie let out a bitter chuckle. "God, you're pathetic." Jonathan stilled. She tilted her head. "Do you even hear yourself? You left your wife for me, Jonathan, and now you're crawling back to her." He zipped up his bag, grabbed his watch, and turned to face her. His voice was calm. "I never said I left her for you." Sophie's eyes narrowed. "Screw you." Jonathan didn't care, because for the first time in weeks, he finally knew what he needed to do. It wasn't about winning Maggie back. It was about facing what he had lost. And Jonathan Hayes was about to find out if it was already too late. The moment Jonathan Hayes stepped through the grand entrance of his New York estate, he felt it. Something had changed. The house was alive. Laughter, music, the clinking of champagne glasses. A party. His party? No, he hadn't planned anything yet. Here it was. His grip on his suitcase tightened as he strode deeper into the house. The sight before him stunned him into silence. The place that had once felt cold and lifeless was now filled with energy. Dozens of guests, elegantly dressed, filled the grand hall. Waiters moved between them, offering drinks. The room was warm, glowing the very opposite of what it had been when he left. And then he saw Maggie. Hayes stood near the center of the room, wrapped in a midnight blue gown that clung to her figure with effortless elegance. Her hair, once always practical and neat, now cascaded over her shoulders in soft, luxurious waves. Her lips, that same bold red, curved into a smile as she laughed at something the man beside her had said. Jonathan barely registered anything except for one brutal, inescapable truth. She looked happy. Not forced, not pretending, genuinely, breathtakingly happy. And the worst part? It had nothing to do with him. Beside her stood a man, tall, well-dressed, confident, the kind of man who commanded attention without even trying. Jonathan hated him instantly. His jaw clenched as he watched. Watched the way Maggie leaned slightly toward the man as they talked, the way her eyes lit up, the way she looked. Free. A sharp burning sensation twisted in his chest before he could stop himself. His feet moved forward. Maggie turned just as he approached, and the moment their eyes met, Jonathan knew he wasn't prepared for this. She didn't look shocked to see him, didn't look angry. She looked unbothered, like his presence didn't shake her at all. And somehow that was worse than anything else. "What are you doing, Maggie?" Jonathan's voice was low, demanding, and laced with emotion. He barely understood himself. Maggie arched a perfectly sculpted brow. "Enjoying my night? You?" Her calmness only fueled his frustration. He stepped closer. "Who the hell is he?" His eyes flicked toward the man beside her. Maggie tilted her head, amused. "That's none of your business." Jonathan's patience snapped. "You're my wife." Maggie smiled and didn't waver. "Funny. I don't recall you caring about that when you left with Sophie." A sharp silence followed. Some guests had started to notice whispers and curious glances. Jonathan didn't care. His eyes were locked on her, the woman he thought he knew. "What the hell is this, Maggie?" His voice was quieter now, but still edged with something dangerous. Maggie held his gaze for a long moment. Then finally she spoke the words she had been holding in for far too long. "Isn't this what you wanted, Jonathan?" His brows furrowed. "What are you talking about?" She exhaled, shaking her head slightly, her voice soft but firm. "You always assumed I would be here, that no matter how far you strayed, I'd be waiting for you to come back." She lifted her chin. "But, Jonathan, I am not that woman anymore." Jonathan stilled. The words hit harder than he expected. For years he had taken Maggie for granted, assuming she would always be there. And now she wasn't. Not because of another man. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she had finally chosen herself. And Jonathan felt something break inside him, something he hadn't even realized was fragile. For the first time in his life, he felt what it truly meant to lose. And the worst part? It was all his fault. The party had ended. The guests had left. The house was silent again. But this time it wasn't the same cold emptiness Jonathan had always known. No, this time it was his own regret suffocating him. Maggie was still there, standing in the grand living room, sipping a glass of wine as if she weren't the reason his entire world had just shifted beneath his feet. She looked untouchable, unshaken, and for the first time, Jonathan didn't see his wife standing there. He saw a woman he had lost, a woman he might never get back. Jonathan took a deep breath, then stepped forward. "We need to talk." Maggie didn't look at him right away. She swirled the wine in her glass, her expression unreadable. "About what?" His jaw clenched. "About us." That got her attention. She let out a soft chuckle, setting her glass down before turning to face him fully. "There is no us, Jonathan. You made sure of that." The words hit hard. Hard. He swallowed. "I was wrong, Maggie." Her brows lifted slightly, as if unimpressed. "Oh, and what exactly were you on about?" Jonathan exhaled slowly about everything. A flicker of emotion crossed her face. But it wasn't pain. Not anymore. That's when he realized she wasn't saying these things to hurt him. She was saying them because she had already healed, and that terrified him more than anything else. "I was too stupid to see what I had," he admitted. "I took you for granted. I thought you'd always be there. And He hesitated, the words heavy. "I was a fool." Maggie. Silence stretched between them. Then finally she spoke. "Yes, you were." Jonathan flinched. "But he deserved that." Maggie studied him, tilting her head slightly. "Why are you really here, Jonathan?" His throat tightened. "Because I want you back." She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. "Jonathan." "Maggie, please." His voice dropped, raw and desperate in a way he had never allowed before. "Give me a chance to fix this." She let out a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You don't get to walk away from me and then decide when you want me back." "I know." He stepped closer. "But I also know I can't lose you." Her expression didn't waver. "You already did." His heart clenched painfully. "Then let me prove to you that I can change." Maggie's lips parted slightly, as if his words had caught her off guard. She studied him for a long moment before whispering, "And what if I don't love you anymore?" Jonathan felt the air leave his lungs. She wasn't saying it to hurt him. She was saying it because she didn't know. And that was worse, because love, her love, had been the only thing he had always been sure of. And now it was gone. Jonathan cut Sophie out of his life completely. No explanations, no drawn-out conversations. Just a clean, brutal ending. Then he did something he had never done before. He went public. "I was a terrible husband to the woman who deserved the best of me, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that I can be better." The media went into a frenzy. The man who had always guarded his personal life like a fortress had just bared himself for the world to see. But Jonathan didn't care, because this wasn't about his reputation. It was about Maggie, and then he went even further. He found out everything she loved, the things she used to talk about that he never listened to. The art gallery she had always wanted to visit, the charity work she had dreamed of expanding on, the small hidden bookstore she used to frequent before their marriage became suffocating. And one by one, he brought those things back in her life. Not to impress her, not to buy her back, but to show her that for the first time, he was paying attention. Weeks passed. Jonathan had expected Maggie to soften quickly. She didn't. She watched his efforts with cautious eyes, refusing to let herself believe too easily. But one night, under the golden glow of their home balcony, the same place where their love had once died, she finally spoke. "If I give you a chance, it will be on my terms." Jonathan swallowed hard. "Anything?" Her gaze was steady. No lies, no half measures, and no expectations that things will go back to the way they were. He nodded without hesitation. "I don't want what we were, Maggie." His voice was hoarse. "I want something better." A slow breath left her lips. She wasn't convinced yet, but she was willing to try. And for Jonathan, that was more than enough. Months later, they stood on that same balcony, side by side, watching the city lights flicker below them. Jonathan turned to her. "Do you regret giving me another chance?" Maggie smirked. "Ask me again in a year." Jonathan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Fair enough. They weren't perfect. They weren't fixed. But they were trying." And for the first time in his life, Jonathan understood. Love wasn't about winning someone back. It was about becoming the kind of man who deserved to stay. And this time, he intended to stay forever. Jonathan thought he could walk away from his marriage without consequences. He believed Maggie would always be there, waiting, forgiving, loving him despite everything. But love doesn't survive on neglect. And Maggie, she wasn't just the wife he left behind. She was the woman who found herself again. Jonathan had to learn the hard way that love isn't about possession. It's about cherishing what you have before it's too late. And when given a second chance, he didn't just fight to get her back. He fought to be the man she deserved. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to So Stirring Stories. We bring you emotional and heartwarming tales that remind us all. Love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice we make every single day. See you in the next one.